we come together to discuss Dr. Gozde Hussain's book, Islamic Doctrines and Political Liberalism, Muslims' Sincere Support, which is just published. This work explores the compatibility of Islam with liberal democratic values by conducting a comparative analysis of Islamic moral discourse alongside John Rawls' liberal democratic framework. Dr. Hussain, as I had the privilege of working with her, I mean, just observing her doing her PhD at the department, critically examines various Orthodox Islamic perspective, questioning whether devout Muslims can, from within their own doctrinal tradition, justify endorsing liberal state. The book presents a carefully argued case showing that such compatibility is indeed achievable through reasoned interpretation of Islamic sources. Simultaneously, it offers reflections on how liberal states can accommodate religious doctrines that may seem in tension with liberal principles, allowing Muslims to maintain their religious commitments without necessitating an Islamic political authority. We are also fortunate to have two distinguished discussants joining us today to provide their reflections on the book. First, we have Professor Mohammad Fadel from the Faculty of Law, University of Toronto. Professor Fadel is a leading scholar in Islamic legal history and has written extensively on Islam and liberalism. His expertise in legal theory and historical Islamic jurisprudence will provide, I'm sure, invaluable insights into the book's argument. Our second discussant is our very own Dr. Jonathan Seglow, a reader in political theory at Royal Holloway, University of London. Dr. Seglow's research focuses on liberal political theory, particularly issues of religious and moral pluralism. His insights into the intersection of political liberalism and Islamic thought will, again, I believe, enrich our discussion today. A bit of disclaimer that he supervised along with, I know I can notice among the participants, we have Dr. Michael Bacon, if I'm not mistaken, supervised Gozde's PhD during her studies in our department, working on a very same project. The structure of today's event is as perhaps the one which worked for us. Each discussant will have 12 to 15 minutes to present a reflection on the book. I would like to encourage both Professor Fadel and Dr. Seglow to basically conclude their remarks by raising some key questions for Dr. Hussain to respond to. Following this, Dr. Hussain will provide her own reflection on the book, its argument and its broader implications. And finally, we will open the floor for Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, you may post your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the discussion. I will compile and present them to the panel in the final segment. With that, I would like to hand over to our first discussant, Professor Fadel. Professor Fadel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this book launch. It's a great honor for me, and I'm very happy that young scholars are taking up this theme and trying to sort of thinking about some of the questions that I've written on in greater detail, so that a certain line of inquiry doesn't sort of die with one person. So that's very encouraging. So I had a chance to read the book, and I had obviously there's a lot to say. So I want to divide my comments kind of into two parts. First is the interpretation of Rawls, which I think is perhaps even much more fundamental to the book. And second, I think, is the reading of the Islamic tradition. Right. So I think I'll begin with questions I had on Gozde's Is that how you pronounce your name, Gozde?
Gozde, yes.
Okay, Gozde. Her reading of Rawls. So there's one thing, and maybe I misunderstood you on this, but I thought you were proceeding on the assumption that it is crucial to be reasonable that one must endorse the freestanding conception of justice as a freestanding thing. Now, there's a kind of a paradox here in everything that Rawls writes, I think, because the freestanding conception of justice is only freestanding from a third-party perspective. It's not freestanding from the perspective of an actual citizen who is in a position of reflective equilibrium. If you imagine any citizen, any reasonable citizen in the well-ordered society who is in a state of perfect reflective equilibrium, um, the principles of justice will be wholly internal to that person's comprehensive doctrine, assuming the person has a comprehensive doctrine. So from the subjective perspective of the citizen, at least as I read Rawls, the conception of justice is not freestanding at all. It's actually completely internal to the person's comprehensive doctrine. And so this leads to kind of a paradox, I think, because depending on how you perceive, depending on your perspective, right? The conception of justice can either be freestanding and solely limited to the political, or it can be wholly internal to a comprehensive doctrine, right? And in some ways, Rawls wants the freestanding conception of justice at some point in time to be wholly internal to the comprehensive doctrines of all reasonable citizens in the well-ordered society. Because if that were the case, then you have a perfect case for stability. Because if every single person in the well-ordered society can endorse the principles of justice from entirely the internal perspective of her comprehensive doctrine, then we know we have stability for the right reasons. Okay, so this has a practical payoff, I think, when we're assessing different doctrines, because it becomes the wrong question to ask, oh, is this person willing to endorse a freestanding conception of justice? Because that person, if you pose the question that way, they say, of course I don't endorse a freestanding conception of justice, because justice must come from God, for example. Right? A true conception of justice must come from God. But what Rawls asks, Rawls is not asking that question. Do you have to endorse the freestanding conception of justice as freestanding? What he is saying is that the conception of justice must be presented as though it is freestanding, because that's the only way that it can function as a module that can sort of fit in all these different conceptions of the good. But that doesn't mean that it's actually freestanding. In reality, it is not freestanding. It just has pluralistic foundations, right? The whole idea of an overlapping consensus, as I understand Rawls, is that there are numerous different doctrines that are otherwise incommensurate that can nevertheless endorse the principles of justice from their own internal perspective, right? And so when they do so, they're not endorsing the idea that it's freestanding, right? We only call it freestanding because we're afraid of alienating people from endorsing it, because we don't want them we don't want to present the political conception in such a way that it requires them to endorse certain metaphysical physical principles that they would find controversial, right? For example, a Muslim might endorse the principles of justice taken as a freestanding doctrine, but might reject the metaphysical principles of Locke or of Kant or of Rawls, for that matter, right? Rawls is sensitive to this. And so he says what's important is that they, as a political matter, endorse the constitutional principles for reasons that they consider significant, right? Morally persuasive and binding. And so from that perspective, it is not freestanding at all. Rather, it's internal to the adherents' comprehensive doctrine. So I think that might change the way you pose certain kinds of questions in the book if you accept that kind of view. The other question that I think that sort of haunts this book is a question: well, what would happen if Muslims became a majority of England, right? And I mean, it's kind of a strange question to ask, right? Because Muslims aren't, it's not plausible that Muslims will become a majority of the citizens in the United Kingdom anytime soon, right? But of course, Rawls has a theory about this. Rawls believes that reasonable pluralism is not simply a result of moral commitments, although it is partially that. Rather, it's an enduring sociological feature of societies governed by free institutions, effectively governed by free institutions. So if a society is effectively governed by free institutions, then the free operation of reason will produce reasonable pluralism, right? And so the question itself is a kind of weird one if you're accepting Rawls's sociological description of societies effectively governed by free institutions, right? It's kind of like, can God build a rock so great that God can't move it? It seems like a question that doesn't accept the idea of God, right? And so this question that sort of haunts the book, well, what would happen if a majority of the United Kingdom became Muslims, right? Is kind of like that. Because on Rawls's terms, it's hard to imagine how any group, if we're talking about a society that's effectively governed by free institutions, how any group could become hegemonic, right? So it's not simply a question of Muslims, it's anybody, right? That's the very nature of a society governed by free institutions that will create and reinforce and sustain reasonable pluralism. Now, this might seem like a pedantic point, or, I'm not trying to, I'm trying to dismiss it, but there's a reason why I want to dismiss it. Because I find it to be a politically pernicious line of inquiry. If we're looking at actual, like, militant democracy, right? So, it kind of feeds into a discourse of militant democracy, and your book goes into this issue of what do you do with the intolerant? I'll try to get to that in a second, or tie that into this discussion. So militant democracy basically kinds to justify the grounds on which otherwise applicable rights can be suspended. So you can suspend democratic rights to preserve democracy. Okay, that seems reasonable. But when you look and see when it's actually applied, right? It's never applied when you actually need it. You can look at my country, the United States, right now, right? We are not capable, or more generally, democracies are not capable of applying militant democracy precisely at the moments when you really need it, when you have a very strong social force that is using democratic means to undermine democracy. That's precisely when you would want to be able to deploy militant democracy, but you can't because they're too strong, right, relative to the rest of society. But what you can do is you can use it as a club to beat up marginalized groups. And so militant democracy as a practical matter of politics is used to justify the suspension of rights of the relatively weak. And so for that reason, I like to push back against this argument entirely. Why don't we use it against white nationalists instead? That's sort of the better thing. We accept as a general rule, arguments of majorities or cultural majorities that minorities represent threats, right? Even though those threats are very implausible, both from the perspective of political sociology and from a normative perspective, like normative political theory. Normative political theory tells us it's implausible to think that an unreasonable sect of Muslims is going to become a majority of the citizens in the United States or the UK. If that were realistic, there's something deeply wrong with our democratic culture, right? On the other hand, right, we do have very strong movements of sort of cultural, for lack of a better term, cultural political blocks of majorities or near majorities that are quite willing to suspend rights of other groups, right? And so I worry about this kind of inquiry from that perspective, that it doesn't seem to have much justification from an internal Rawlsian perspective. And externally, it can be used for quite nefarious ends, right? And so for that reason, I wasn't very sympathetic of your criticism of Andrew, that it was just really sort of a Hobbesian, his approach was very Hobbesian, right? Because I think that the realistic view is that Muslims are a minority in the West and they will remain a minority in the West. And the question is, in that position, right, do they have moral reasons to endorse the political conception of liberal democracies? And I think he gives good answers. I mean, when I say good answers, I mean, I think he gives accurate answers. Whether they're good or not, I leave to others to evaluate. He gives accurate answers of what Muslims are theorizing about this, right? And so I don't think it's quite accurate to say that it's a Hobbesian argument at the end of the day and just merely a modus vivendi. I think it is deeper than that. Now, finally, just I have to say a little bit about what you said about my arguments. It's true, you're right, that I did not give a full-blown religious argument for why Muslims should endorse constitutional democracy. And the reason I do that is, I mean, yes, in part I'm writing as a political theorist and not as a theologian, but it's also because of something Rawls says. Rawls says that, it's our responsibility as political philosophers to put forward the principles of justice, right? We can determine what the principles of justice are as a matter of philosophical inquiry using the veil of ignorance, etc. And then it's the responsibility of individual citizens to determine how the principles of justice relate to their own conception, to their own doctrines of the good, right? So ultimately, Rawls sort of kicks back to individual citizens the sort of nuts and bolts of how they're going to come into theoretic reflective equilibrium with the principles of justice. And so what I was trying to suggest is that for a certain group of Muslim citizens who grow up in a liberal democracy and are philosophically inclined, because you have to remember, one argument that Rawls promotes for stability, and I think, again, it's a very practical one, is most people are not philosophically coherent. Most people are pluralists, right? They're like cafeteria Catholics. They take this part and they take this part and they put it together, and it might not be a coherent philosophical system, but from the political perspective, it's good enough to sustain the stability of free institutions. Again, we can question whether Rawls is right or not. I myself have a lot of skepticism about that, but that's Rawls's claim, right? And so we would have to say, well, that's got to be true for most Muslims too. Most Muslims who grow up in a society, that a nearly just society, whatever you want to call it, in terms of the actual societies in which we live, they are going to be kind of pluralistic Muslims. They are not going to necessarily want to or have the desire to engage in some kind of attempt at creating a systematic theology that accounts for why this set of institutions is consistent with their what they claim their highest beliefs are, because most human beings aren't preoccupied by these problems, right? And so I don't think it's necessary actually to give a systematic account, right, beginning with proofs of God all the way to quotidian rules of law, as to why this is all theologically coherent, and Muslims should believe this upon pain of some kind of um, blameworthiness religiously if they don't. It's rather just to point out to Muslims who do care about having some kind of systematic approach that reconciles their theological beliefs and moral beliefs with their political commitments, that there are resources that can be mined to help them achieve this kind of this reflective equilibrium that Rawls thinks is desirable among citizens, right? And to try to create a map, a doctrinal map that would pave the way for them to do that. Now, of course, it would be nice if I did do what you suggested, but at the end of the day, I don't know how relevant that kind of work is, except for the fact that what you need to do, ideally, what you would like to see is a critical mass of work like that being developed over time, right? But just speaking from my perspective on the status of the state of the Muslim community, it's not realistic to believe that's going to be achieved at this point in time. I mean, maybe in a couple of generations where there are lots of people who write about this and there's lots of internal debate, we can again speak about some kind of internal theological consensus about it. But it's really sort of, I think, too early to imagine something like that taking place. Now, in terms of just quickly, do you have time?
Sure. Yes.
Just a couple more minutes. Finally, with respect to your descriptions of Islamic doctrines, I think for your future work, you're going to need, if you continue in this this field, I think there's a lot of literature that you will need to take on board. Many of the secondary sources that you cite, some of them are dated, some of them themselves are, I would say, reliant on secondary scholarship, don't necessarily represent their own individual research. And so I would encourage you going forward to really spend a lot more time and energy in the theological tradition, right? I think that a lot of your arguments would not be very persuasive to specialists in the field. And I'll just use one example. Your claim about reason. So when I said you're criticizing me for my approach to the burdens of judgment, I believe, and you were saying that in the Islamic tradition, the limits of reason mean that justify revelation, displacing reason. And I'm not quite sure I agree with that, because there's also limits to revelation. This is one of the points of theology, is to show that what we can learn from revelation is also itself limited, right? And that's one aspect, that revelation itself does not give us conclusive knowledge for lots of things. So it's not quite clear that just because reason is limited, then revelation can supply our answers. I'm talking about from the perspective of theology, right? The second thing is, it's not also clear that the mature Ash'ari theological position rejects the claim that reason can determine what's good for us. So as you know, you talk about the theory of maqasid. The whole theory of maqasid is based on the idea that human reason is perfectly capable of grasping what's good for it. So that's not really the theological dispute as is identified by later theologians between the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazilis. I don't want to get into the weeds about theology. I'm just saying that I think there's a lot more complexity to the arguments, and they would help you in your in the political analysis. And so I think your work would benefit from a much deeper engagement with these sources than was in the book. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fadel, for such thought-provoking sort of reflection. And I for one learned a lot, and I would basically believe Gozde will get back to them. But in the meantime, if I may, I would just want to invite Dr. Seglow to share with us his ideas.
Thanks, Mohammad. Can you hear me okay now? I'm now joining on my phone.
Yes,
I can hear you.
Yes.
Good. Thanks. Okay, I'll try to really give an overview of what the book says, because I expect most people here haven't read it, but they should. They should go and buy it and read it at once, because it's a great book. So to situate Gozde's project, there's a very long-standing conflict between Islam and liberalism, going back to, for example, Massaid Orientalism, Islamophobia, politically speaking, Islamophobia in Western Europe and elsewhere. And Gozde calls for active dialogue and engagement between these two traditions. The narrower project is to consider the liberal theory of the preeminent 20th, perhaps 21st century liberal thinker, John Rawls, and contemporary Islamic doctrines. I think it's a real strength of the book that it shows expert knowledge of both, because not many people do that. There are a few exceptions. Professor Fadel is an exception, Andrew March is an exception, but there aren't many. So Rawls presents his liberal theory of individual rights and liberties as, what he says, political, not metaphysical. It doesn't claim to be true or correct, but it claims to be reasonable, something people can reasonably accept. That's what Professor Fadel meant, I think, by being freestanding. He thinks it could form the object of an overlapping consensus between different religious and other intellectual traditions. It could therefore be seen as legitimate. So, wherever you come from. I'm going to ask 5 questions of Gozde. So I guess one question is, sometimes she wants to say something a bit stronger, which is that Muslims and indeed others will see it as a just, describing a just political system, which is something rather stronger. I accept the Conservative government between 2019 and 2024 in this country as legitimate. I didn't think it was just. I think Rawls is about how you interpret Rawls. Maybe he's just saying that people need to accept that the political conception of liberal justice is the foundation of the legitimate state. Gozde goes on in chapter 2 to talk about, in general terms, how we do comparative political theorizing between different traditions. She says we have to deprovincialize the Western viewpoint. She avoids, I think, 2 mistakes, one of which, opposite mistakes, one of which is to see non-Western traditions of thinking as useful supplements to Western-orientated theorizing, and the other is the opposite, of sort of wholly rejecting Western liberalism in a kind of militant decolonial move. She says we have to prioritize the values of inclusivity, respect, sympathy, and above all, restraint. Others present their own doctrines on their own terms, and if there isn't consensus, then there isn't. When it comes to Rawls's project, Gozde implicitly, it doesn't say much about it, endorses Rawls' distinction between simple and reasonable pluralism. So there's always going to be a diversity of opinion in a liberal society, but the question is people who are prepared to be reasonable, prepared to cooperate politically, how much diversity is there? People who are not really it's a question of trying to prevent them from seizing the reins of political power, which I'll come back to in a moment. She says that what Rawls calls the burdens of judgment, which is an explanation of why we disagree morally and politically, because evidence is complex, because concepts are indeterminate, because they have different subjective life experiences and so forth, is too demanding for Muslims, because it requires a recognition that the denial of God and much else in Islam is reasonable. I wonder if that's necessarily true, because later on, this comes later in the book, she draws on, if I pronounce his name correctly, Mohammad Abdullah an-Naim's view that there's a sharp distinction between God's word in the Sharia and human-made political institutions. We can't conclusively and infallibly interpret God's world. So maybe it could be, in other words, you could accept the Islamic picture, God, the Prophet, the Quran, and all the rest of it, but apply the burdens of judgment to the political implications of that, where you do acknowledge other people who have different views. You're not just saying they're mistaken, but you reasonably disagree with them. She says it's very important, and I agree, that it's very important to consider the range of representative Islamic traditions, and much of the book, indeed most of it, is dedicated to discussing those. There's always been pluralism within the Islamic intellectual and legal tradition. We need to look not just at the hadiths of the Quran, but Islamic jurisprudence and advice to ruler literature. It's a very rich, diverse, flexible tradition. So, you know, some of what Islamic scholars think about justice is through their engagement with Aristotelian thought. And she emphasizes above all the capacity of Islamic doctrine, different Islamic doctrines' capacity to change and evolve in the future. And that's very important because Rawls thinks just the same. Rawls looks back to the wars of religion between Protestants and Catholics in Europe and how a modus vivendi, that's to say, a contingent civil peace, transformed itself into a more stable commitment to liberalism, where each can practice their own branch of Christianity. So she wants to apply that to the Muslim world. Nonetheless, she has to contend, and this is in chapter 6, with Muslims who think that there must be an Islamic state, not in the sense of the movement, but in a more generic sense, which will enforce Islamic orthodoxy contra liberal rights and freedoms. So against that, she quotes again an-Naim that the enactment of Sharia principles is a political act. It's not necessarily divine will. This reminds me a little bit of the policy of the Tony Blair government in Britain between 1997 and 2007, which created so-called control orders, where people who are suspected of harboring illiberal motivations, but possibly terroristic ones, were imprisoned without a trial in order to preserve the freedoms of the rest of us. Gozde says this is a moral, Gozde says this is the moral blind alley, because people's rights are infringed either way. So you imprison people through control orders, you infringe their rights. You let them act freely, they will infringe others' rights. But that's not quite symmetrical, it seems to me, because a government which prevents Islamic illiberalism by imprisoning people is acting on what they think may occur in the future. And of course, it may not occur at all. That depends on all sorts of contingent political circumstances. Or, of course, we wait until we treat non-liberal Muslims who believe more radical views more liberally. We don't have things like control orders. But then, of course, we have to wait until what occurs has occurred or not. And that goes against the concern, Rawls' concern, Gozde's concern with stability and liberalism. So I guess that's my third issue, the moral blind alley. Sorry, my second was about the burdens of judgment. My first is about legitimacy and justice. Okay, I'm going to talk for about 3 or 4 minutes more. With regard to the vast majority of Muslim doctrines which are not radical in this way, Gozde believes that they can, over time, shift, as Rawls believes, from a contingent political compromise to an overlapping consensus on liberal rights and freedoms, in part because their Islamic doctrines can change and transform into in a more liberal way over time, in part because even in the absence of an Islamic state, Muslims can still uphold the higher objectives of Islamic law, promote welfare, justice, some of which are not especially religious in nature. She says under unfavorable conditions, that's to say Muslims are a minority, the secular political order can still afford Muslims the opportunity to promote the Islamic conception of justice and welfare. And this view lies within the spectrum of acceptable interpretations of divine sources, so it's persuasive for a moderately observant Muslim. But there's still a necessary shift to support a liberal regime itself. And this can come about, Gozde argues, if we accept the Rawlsian view that reasonable, what he calls comprehensive doctrines, traditions of thought, ideals, religious or secular, as I said, are dynamic, can change. And she says eventually they find justification for liberal ideas from within, leading to an Islamic overlapping consensus where the liberal political order is preferable, or at least a viable alternative. Maybe that bears on whether it's seen as legitimate or just. I guess my final point is there's a certain intellectualism to the book. That's a good thing in some ways. I mean, it's an intellectual book, but I don't mean it in that way. I mean that, Gozde says in the conclusion, the book proposes moral reasons and strategies for the liberal state to address incompatible Islamic doctrines. Further analysis, she says, is necessary to determine whether Muslims acquire persuasion regarding the effective preservation of religious practices within an Islamic political authority. So, Gozde uses the phrase non-ideal state in a particular way to mean for Muslims a state which isn't Islamic, but Rawls uses it in a slightly different way to mean a state that is not fully just according to his conception of liberalism. In that latter sense, it describes the kind of liberal democratic state we're in now in the UK, certainly in the United States too. So I wonder how far Muslims support for a liberal state. Many Muslims, very many do support it. Those who are more hesitant, how much that hinges on the compatibility of their doctrinal sources and liberal political values, which is Gozde's argument in the book, which is a very rationalistic view, cognitive view, intellectualist view, and how much it's to do with the sort of messy everyday realities of discrimination, stigma, marginalization, Islamophobia, hate speech, microaggressions, and all the rest of it. And maybe if we focus on the latter, because people are not always as rational as political theorists like to believe, we wouldn't have to worry too much about the kind of philosophical compatibility, which I think sort of is not so removed from some of the remarks Professor Fadel made towards the end of his comments. Okay, thanks, I'll leave it there.
Great, Thank you very much, Jonathan, again for your remarks and reflection. I know that you've been part of this journey for years with Gozde, so you have that privilege as well. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our, the woman of the hour, Dr. Gozde Hussain, to share with us her reflection as well as, possibly addressing the question which was raised by both Professor Fadel and Dr. Seglow.
Thank you so much, Mohammad. Thanks for the nice introduction. I would like to first thank you and Hussein for organizing this event. And I'm very grateful for Dr. Seglow and Prof. Fadel to take their time and analyze my book. And also, warm thank you to everyone who attended today. So there are a lot to take in. I will try to address them as much as possible. I don't think we will have time to address all of it. But starting with Prof. Fadel's concern about whether acknowledging the justness of freestanding political conception of justice is required by Rawls. And my interpretation, I was actually, when I was listening to him, I was looking for very clear quotation from John Rawls about this, but I couldn't find it. So my interpretation is based on very clear quotations from Rawls, rather than my own interpretation of Rawls. And he's suggesting that reasonable people will affirm to reasonable doctrines, and reasonable doctrines are the ones do not advocate for theological or patriarchal government. Okay, so they need to give up on that claim. So they need to claim on that claim that they need to give up on the claim that theological government is the only legitimate one for us. And in fact, when I criticize March, I did point it out that March himself acknowledges that the appropriate object of Islamic overlapping consensus or any overlapping consensus is the conception of justice. March himself acknowledges that Rawls requires this, but he presents this objective as a few missing pieces from his own research. But what I argue is that these a few missing pieces is the very definition between the Islamic modus vivendi and Islamic overlapping consensus. This is why I classify his work as Islamic modus vivendi, because it doesn't pass the test that Rawls sets up for reasonableness and for the stability of the society. Again, March himself acknowledges that Rawls's theory requires support independent of the unfavorable conditions of reasonable doctrines or reasonable citizens. And the ethical tradition that he engages is all about very contingent situations about Muslims, which is when they are politically unfavorable conditions. So he makes a comment about, well, it's not very likely that Muslims are going to become majority anyway. That's true, but it could be true. Obviously, we can't really say for sure. But it's not just about they becoming a majority. It's also about Muslims are being politically unfavorable condition. So Muslims can be 30% of the population and hold the political power. Would they challenge the stability? So for Rawls, to avoid this, we need their unconditional support for the legitimacy of freestanding political conception of justice. It's also important that for Muslims to be able to see themselves as a valuable part of this society, they don't support the freestanding political concepts. Well, they don't support the liberal state from this contingent perspective. They should be saying, well, this is a state that I'm part of it, and I see it as a fair moral project, not until the favorable conditions present itself. That's also important for Muslims on these positions. So there is that. In terms of the containment argument, Fadel's point of view, I think this containment argument will apply to extremist right wing as well. I obviously address incompatible Islamic views, but it's also very general. Whoever challenges the stability of the society, discriminates other groups, or whoever undermines the very principles of liberal state, they are subject to this containment account that I am presenting. And the other one that I would like to address, I'm sorry if I am missing anything and if you would like me to clarify later on. So for those who are maybe not familiar with my criticism of Mohammad Fadel in my book, is that there are two. One is, I say the analogy that Mohammad Fadel, Prof. Fadel makes between burdens of judgment and Muslims' recognition of fallibility of human reason, I argue that it's an overstatement, because I think they are completely different in their nature. So to start with burdens of judgment, what I understand burden of judgment to be suggesting that citizens should be acknowledging the insurmountability of human reason, especially when it comes to the questions of truth. What would this mean is that there are almost inherent limitations to human reason that would prevent us from convincing each other about our conception of the good life. And Rawls believes that through this, people will come to this conclusion. Well, since there are limitations of human reason, people with, people sincere and rational can disagree with me on the questions of the existence of God. So this is the context, and this is what liberals, political liberals, defines who is reasonable, who is not reasonable. So if you explain the pluralism through this argument, you are reasonable. If not, you are unreasonable. And I find it quite stringent for convinced Muslims or convinced believers, because this is a very controversial epistemological argument. I mean, if I believe that there are inherent limitations of human reasoning, I should be kind of skeptical about my own position. Even though Rawls says that you shouldn't be, I just cannot see how I cannot. That's the argument that I made in another paper, not this book. I just mentioned it briefly, but that's why I argue that it's very stringent. On the other hand, Prof. Fadel suggests that in the Islamic intellectual tradition, we acknowledge the limits of human reasoning, but the context that we acknowledge is this. In the theological argument between Ash'aris and Mutazallis, they argue when the revelation and the reason conflict, which one we should prioritize. And Ash'ari's argument is that since there are limitations on human reasoning and revelation is the ultimate truth, we should use reason to justify the revelation. Also, they are using this limitation of human reasoning to justify the intra-Muslim pluralism in the legal discussion. So there could be more than one ruling because, you know, human reason is limited. So I don't think these are very similar to what Rawls would, what burdens of judgment is, because first of all, one is justifying the revelation, the other one is just allowing the intra-Muslim pluralism. From this tradition, extending this argument to the denial of God is not very plausible. In fact, if we look at the contemporary context, like Maududi, Koch, Qaradawi, they are referencing limitations of human reason to justify the evilness of secular political order. They're saying that because human beings are so imperfect, they're weak, their knowledge are weak, that's why the appropriate political order should be the divine one, not the secular one. So just because they're acknowledging limitations of human reason doesn't make them similar. And this brings me to the other point, which why I think Prof. Madud should not be very humble, but should be a bit more assertive, rather than expecting Muslims to you know, figure out this sort of arguments by themselves. He should be explicit about his theological position, because the same arguments are used by Islamic scholars, other Islamic scholars, very explicitly, very directly, giving fatwas, you know, giving rulings to attack, you know, secular political order, or in fact, reduce the Muslimness to the establishment of Islamic State. You know, there are really strong reasons. So we can't really, in the face of this, we can't really expect ordinary Muslims to just implicitly find some sort of very secretive reasons in the traditional Islamic discussions. So that's what I believe. And this actually probably would led me to Jonathan's argument, whether An-Naim's argument is similar to burdens of judgment. It is similar to burdens of judgment, but it still doesn't extend to the view that denial of God is reasonable. So I still think burden of judgment is a bit more stringent than An-Naim's argument, but yes, I think that's correct. Sorry, we got only 2 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. So if there is any, let me just check.
Yeah, I think we have at least 2 questions, and thank you for you know, taking care of the time as well. So question number 1, regarding what the author means by a comparative study, I'm asking whether there are intellectual sources within the Islamic tradition that suggest Islam contains the foundational elements of liberal theory, forming its own version of liberalism, one that is inherently compatible with its Western counterparts. So it's a quite a deep question. I don't know if you want to answer it, but alternatively, does the author argue that liberalism is a purely Western concept, with Islamic scholars only able to adopt a more compatible or sympathetic approach toward it? And we have another one, which I think I can just combine both of them, a slightly speculative question about future theorizing. What might be the prospect of Islamic tradition affirming a more minimal conception of liberalism than full-blown Rawlsianism? For instance, a conception that rejects religious coercion, but it still allows for some perfectionist policies and religion in the public square. Wow, okay.
Okay.
So,
So can you just summarize both questions? I may be all over the place.
so
Like,
one of them is asking about whether we have this, I mean, in shorter version, what would be the Islamic scholarship conception of liberalism to the extent I can understand. And the other one is basically about a concept that rejects religious coercion, but it still allows for some perfectionist policies and religion in public square. So this is, I can ask those who raise this question to basically perhaps open up. So Jacob, I think you're here, so you can, I think, unmute and yeah. So if you want.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good evening, Gozde and Mohammad and everyone. It's good to see you again. So, I mean, what's motivating this question is just something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, and I'm planning to write something on, which is Rawlsianism is obviously a central paradigm within liberal thought, but it's not the only one. There are versions of liberalism. I mean, Cecile Laborde has this work on minimal secularism, which would allow religion to do quite a lot. You can even have religiously inspired laws as long as they're not actually coercing somebody. In certain domains, you can have a role for religion to kind of guide people to a certain view of virtue, and it's not Rawlsian. It's controversial among liberals, but it doesn't contradict every version of liberalism. So I appreciate it's quite out there. But if you do have any thoughts at all on the future prospects maybe for some kind of comparative theory of that nature, I'd be really fascinated.
Yes. Yeah, it's a very big question. Thanks, and it's a very good question as well. I mean, I am Rawlsian, so I would say you can, using public reason, you can implement your religious rulings. So what you need to say is that you need to just appeal to public reason rather than your own reason. So let's say you need a mosque, or you need some sort of religious establishment. You just need to say, that's my religious right, rather than saying God wants me to do that. So for me, it's possible. I mean, maybe other Rawlsian would argue that no, it's too much, but I think that's perfectly plausible from Rawlsian perspective. It is my interpretation of Rawls that is actually allowing this sort of practices, if you ask me.
Yeah.
So I think I listened your discussion on the Islamic Sharia courts in Britain. Talk, yeah. So for me, from Rawlsian point of view, you can just you did such a good job justifying their existence by appealing to public reason.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make
I suppose
sense?
a real life example of this would be, suppose the states were to say, look, we're not going to ban alcohol, we're not going to coerce people into not drinking, but we are going to run a public information campaign explaining why religiously alcohol is bad, just to try to persuade people non-violently. No, presumably Rawlsianism would say you shouldn't do that because you're not using public reason, but some versions of liberalism might say this is permissible, and maybe that's more congenial to certain Muslim perspectives that might be skeptical of Rawlsianism.
I mean, I think from my perspective, Muslims are quite adaptable to public reason. We got the Maslahat tradition, right? We know how to use these reasons. So we don't necessarily have to appeal to our own reasons. So I wouldn't see the scenario where they really desperately need religious reasons to justify the alcohol. And I think that's why our confidence in our rules comes from, because we can justify it for the reasons they think that rational and reasonable. So I don't know, that's my intake.
That's great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Hussain, who raised the second question, is still with us. If Hussain Moussavi, do you want to ask your question and perhaps elaborate on that further with Gozde to address?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you, Gozde, for your great book. I just asking about what you mean by comparative study. I mean, whether you mean that there are intellectual sources within the Islamic tradition suggesting that Islam contains the foundational elements of liberal theory as its own version of liberalism, or we are talking about liberalism as purely Western, with Islamic scholars only able to adopt some sympathetic approach toward it.
I guess your question is about whether I'm thinking, is it the liberal Islamic theories are compatible with liberalism? And obviously, by definition, is true. But the thing I am doing here is that analyzing their methodologies, whether their methodologies are reasonable from within Islamic perspective. And I think that makes a difference, because I am not trying to liberalize Islam. I'm trying to Islamize liberalism in this perspective by suggesting that there are elements that are reasonable, acceptable from within Islamic intellectual tradition. I don't know if it answered your question, but yeah.
Yeah, Islamized liberalism was good. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know if that's as easy and straightforward as that, or could be controversial as well. But I, for one, enjoyed listening to all of you, and I don't know, Professor Fadel or Jonathan, Gozde, do you want to add anything before we conclude the session?
Thank you for your valuable insights, and your attendance means a lot to me. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It was great. I probably spoke too much. I apologize. You should have stopped me.
No. No, it was great.
Thanks very much for organising. It was great to participate. Sorry, I interrupted.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you very much. Wish you all the very best and great weekend. And hopefully we will have you again in our following, and I'm addressing all our attendees following event and book launches. But until then, I wish you all the best, and take care of yourself.
Okay.